Thank you. It's great to be here. I love coming to Alberta and to different communities because in terms of responding to youth homelessness, responding to homelessness, this is the place in Canada where the action is. And every community is different in Alberta, right? Calgary's different from Edmonton. Calgary has the good sports teams. And Lethbridge is different from Red Deer or Medicine Hat. And Red Deer, one thing I've come to learn is the amount of innovation that's going on here, the passion, the commitment, and the fearlessness, right? You have to be fearless in changing things that don't work so well. Another good thing about coming to Red Deer is to come to a city where the main street is your last name. They could have named it Boulanger Boulevard, but they didn't. So anyway, better watch. I don't want to roll this off the stage. So anyway, what I'm going to talk to you today about is some research that I've been doing over the past several years, trying to look at around the world, what are the best approaches to dealing with youth homelessness. I used to work in the homelessness sector in Toronto in the 90s. And back then we were warehousing young people in emergency shelters in Toronto. And now it's 2014 and we're still warehousing youth in homeless shelters. And the older I get, and I am getting older, the more that I conclude that we're doing things horribly wrong when we don't treat young people with respect and give them the things that any young person needs to grow up to be a healthy and happy adult. And so I'm going to share some of these learnings with you today. Some of them come from across Canada, some of them come from elsewhere in the world. And the key to looking at what people do elsewhere is to not say, well, that won't work, it's a different policy context, or that city's a different size, or whatever, but to figure out how do we apply it locally. Because I think all good ideas can be modified and work wherever you're at. So let's have a look at some of these things. And then at the end, we'll have some questions. So in thinking about youth homelessness, I think we've come a long way over the years, right? In the past 10 years, our knowledge about youth homelessness, its causes and its remedies has grown. One thing I want to say about youth homelessness, the starting point, is that youth homelessness is different from adult homelessness. The causes are different, and so the solutions must be different. So what do we know about youth homelessness in Canada? In any given year, there are about 37,000 young people who fall into homelessness, and this isn't including young people who are couch surfing. This is young people who touch the system in some way. They either wind up in shelters or day programs or that kind of thing. And about 6,000 on any given night across the country. That's a lot of young people. And here are the characteristics of the population generally. It'd be interesting to see how this matches up with what you find here. Generally, 2 out of 3 are male. I put that down to the fact that being homelessness is so incredibly risky and dangerous for young women that many young women will stay in very horrible circumstances rather than go to the streets. Some minority populations are overrepresented amongst the youth homeless population, including Aboriginal youth. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered youth are overrepresented. Most youth who become homeless move in and out of it fairly rapidly, but for those who don't, the average length of stay is 4 years in the research that I've done. 4 years. That's incredible. That's horrible. It's one thing, it's horrible to be homeless for 4 years no matter what age you are, but if you are 16 and you're homeless for 4 years, those are key developmental years of your life that are lost. So we have to stop that. The other thing that's important to talk about youth homelessness is when we think about solutions, age difference matters. It's not just young people are different from adults, but the needs of a 13 or 14-year-old are going to be very different from an 18-year-old or a 24-year-old. So in terms of the causes of homelessness, I like to think of it in terms of 3 main buckets. We typically focus on individual and relational factors, and in fact, if you ask somebody who's homeless, that's usually where people will go. They'll talk about bad things that happen to them, right? So with youth, we know that between 60 and 70% of young people who become homeless are fleeing homes where they're experiencing physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, which on the other side means 30 to 40% aren't fleeing homes in those situations. Typically, family conflict is at the center of things. It could be addictions problems with the young person or with their parents. It could be mental health issues with the young person or their parents, these kind of things. So individual and relational factors are important. And I say that young people will normally identify that, right? Because we personalize when bad things happen to us. You know, I've never met somebody who's homeless who said, my problem started when Canada canceled the national housing strategy in 1993, right? We tend to say a bad thing happened. There are also systems failures, and these are really important too. In our world, we often dump people into homelessness. Sometimes inadvertently, sometimes quite deliberately. So people get discharged from healthcare who have no home to go to, right? That's a big problem in our society, right? Because we've reorganized our healthcare system on the understanding that people recover better at home, right? But there's an assumption there's a home there. If someone doesn't have a home and you discharge them from either mental health inpatient care or from just a regular hospital, the chances are whatever condition they were suffering from will get worse. The research shows that's conclusive. And Alberta's leading the way here on experimenting with discharge planning and supports for people leaving hospitals, which is good. We discharge people from prison, right? So people in Ontario, often when you leave jail, the discharge planning is they slide over a list of homeless shelters to you. That's disastrous policy, because the research also shows conclusively that if you discharge people from prison into homelessness, their chance of reoffending goes way up. So it's actually a crime. A lot of our get tough on crime policies are actually crime production strategies, not crime reduction strategies. And then finally, there's child protection. People leave child protection. Our child protection services are often modeled on what was okay in the 1950s, where you could leave home at 16 or 17, get a job, there was rental housing available, people had good salaries. I mean, it's still more possible in some ways in Alberta to do that than other places in Canada because of the oil industry and the jobs that are there. But for most cases, it isn't. So when people leave care, either by choice or they age out of the system, they are often ill-prepared and ill-resourced, if that's a word, ill-resourced, to live independently and then wind up homeless. And then finally, structural factors. This is important. I'm going to talk about some of these later, but shifts in the economy matter and can produce homelessness. Poverty is a big driver of homelessness. Families having difficulty coping. Violence, family violence, that's a broad societal problem that produces homelessness. But also discrimination. And we often don't think of that as being important. But if a young person experiences racism in school, or when they're trying to get a job or trying to rent a place, that's a contributor to homelessness. And one of the key ones I want to mention again, you know, I mentioned before that lesbian, gay, bisexual youth are overrepresented. Homophobia in our society is one of the last acceptable kinds of discrimination. It produces homelessness. Young people wind up having to leave their homes because of discrimination. Their parents kick them out, or their schools, they're bullied and have to leave, or their communities. So in dealing with homelessness, we have to confront some of those things in our society that are structural. So I mentioned, you know, I worked in the homelessness sector, that in Canada for a long time, we've put most of our energy into emergency services. Now, I've got here a diagram that you see here, and you'll be seeing more of. But there's basically three things you can do to deal with homelessness, right? You can focus on prevention, so stop people from becoming homeless in the first place, do whatever you can. You have to have emergency services because bad things are going to happen. And then you need models of accommodation and support to move people out, right? And in Canada, we focused on the emergency response for very good reason. Like homelessness kind of mushroomed and exploded in the 90s and, you know, the last 20 years or so. And so when you see somebody homeless outside, your first response is, let's give them a shelter, right? Which is a good response. But the emergency response shouldn't be a permanent response. So you recall in Kelowna about 10 years ago, there was a major fire. A great Slave Lake, there was one a couple of years ago, right? So like a fire comes to a city, you evacuate because houses are burning down. You put people in hockey rinks, in motels, in gymnasiums. They stay with friends. You do that because it's an emergency. But if you went back to Kelowna today and there was people still living in the hockey rink, you'd say, we have done a terrible job of dealing with that crisis. That's the problem in Canada. We have people who are chronically homeless, who've been homeless for years, including young people. We're doing something horribly wrong. We need to move from this response, where we put most of our energy and resources, into something new, where we still need that emergency response, but the emergency response should be geared to do what it's supposed to do, help people in a crisis over a short term. We need to shift to a focus on prevention, expand that, and to a model of accommodation and supports. And that's where Alberta, again, is exciting and leading the way and moving that direction. So a lot of the innovation that you're doing here in your community is supporting that agenda. The government of Alberta has far and away the most progressive and interesting response to youth homelessness in this country, and I would argue in North America. And when it's released, it's going to blow your socks off. It will also align well with the work you're doing. So that's all very exciting. We need to get here. We need to get here everywhere in Canada. But it's one thing to say that. We need to shift it, but it's quite another to figure out, like, how do we get there, right? Because prevention's an easy sell to people, right? We all understand it's easier to never smoke than to stop smoking, right? That kind of thing. But if you ask people, what does homelessness prevention look like? It's a little more difficult. So I think we've learned a lot, and a lot of the learnings come from Alberta here on how to do this. And I've identified some key things we need to do to reform our response to youth homelessness. The best approaches go beyond just agency-based programs. You're going to need the agencies, but they have to work together as a system. They have to work in an integrated way. We need a system of care approach. We need the resources and supplies around. We need affordable housing, that kind of thing. And we have to start imagining, and this applies to all homelessness, that the problem of homelessness is not just the homelessness sectors alone, right? Because the causes come from all these other parts of our world, whether it's education, addictions, child protection, corrections, health. Solving homelessness is the task of every part of government and every member of the community. For too long, we've relied on a poorly funded and hardworking group of people in the homelessness sector to solve what is really a problem that goes well beyond them. It's what I call a fusion policy issue, right? Because it actually covers off everything. And that's another innovation in Alberta, which you don't see elsewhere in Canada, with your interagency council on homelessness, bringing together the different ministries. That is an innovation that I wish we were doing in Ontario. So, we need to copy you. Can you come and fix us? I'll get a plane ticket arranged.